All right, so we're starting session 2, which is federal funding landscape, new reality of federal funding and I'd like to welcome up Amy Turner from the Sabin Center to share some thoughts. So she's got some slides, and we want to leave a lot of time for some questions. So do you want that there?
Okay.
There you go.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for having me. Thank you, Dory. I understand we have a lot of local government folks in the room. Are there others in the room? No? Okay. I will keep this local government focused then. So my name is Amy Turner. I work with the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, and I lead our center's local government work. So I help cities, towns, counties across the country sort of understand the legal frameworks that apply when they are pursuing their various climate commitments and climate policies. So the last couple of weeks, I've been paying very close attention to what's happening in Washington and really trying to distill the chaos that has been the last 2 weeks into something that is, distilled to what really matters on the ground in cities and in communities. So I'm going to talk through some of the executive orders that were signed on day 1 of the Trump administration. These are things that did things like pausing disbursement of certain federal funds, IRA and EJA funds, declared a quote energy emergency, rescinded a bunch of Biden-era executive orders, withdrew from the Paris Agreement, did a whole bunch of things in the DEI space, and we will sort of talk through what's happening there. I'll try to go a little deeper on electric vehicles and vehicles in general, since I know that's what y'all are most interested in. But really, I think the thing that I want folks to take away from this conversation is, there's a lot that we don't know at this point. A lot has happened in the last couple of weeks, as you all know. We are watching it very closely. We're trying to give you the most sort of up-to-date guidance on what's going on and what to expect. But a lot of this is changing in real time. I've given this presentation probably 5 or 10 times in the last week, and many of them it has been out of date within minutes of finishing the presentation, if not during. So very dynamic space, and we'll talk about where we are today. So I think probably the thing that's been top of mind for most folks is this pause on disbursements under Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law programs, right? And this originated in Section 7 of one of the executive orders, the Unleashing American Energy Executive Order, which, I'll just read the quote, immediately paused the disbursement of funds appropriated through the IRA or the bipartisan infrastructure law, including but not limited to NEVI and the CFI programs. So obviously, there's a lot in those words, and I think folks were really struggling to grasp what they meant in the first couple of days. There were folks like me who really wanted to believe that they just meant uncontracted dollars. Right? Turns out they did not, but basically this was not a clear directive. There's a lot of ambiguity in it, and a lot has happened in the last 2 weeks. Obviously, if you've picked up a newspaper at all, you are aware of this. The very next day, January 21st, we got a very small amount of clarification from the Office of Management and Budget, which of course is an office that reports directly to the president, clarifying that they didn't mean that highway funding was supposed to be held back. So not a lot of clarity around the things that we care about, climate, clean energy, clean vehicles, but they did not mean that everything was meant to be held back, just the things that the administration didn't like. A week later, January 27th, kind of in the close of business here on the East Coast, word got out about an OMB memo that put a pause on essentially all local federal climate spending, among many other policy priorities, right? This was very, very broad and has continued to be very broad over the last couple of weeks. This obviously both caused so much more confusion, but also put a much finer point on the original executive order, right? They did mean to freeze everything. The very next day, there were 2 lawsuits filed, one by a group of 22 states plus the District of Columbia, and another by a group of nonprofits, public health organizations, and small business organizations. And on January 29th, OMB rescinded that January 27th memo. But as we all know, they didn't really mean it. The press secretary, stood in the press room the next day and said, we're rescinding this because people got upset about it, but we're not actually pulling back on the funding freeze, right? Those executive orders, particularly this one we're talking about in the climate and clean energy space, those still stand. We just know everyone got upset about our executive order the other day. She put it on Twitter. I love someday to read a legal history of tweets submitted in lawsuits, because this tweet did appear in some judges' decisions in the two cases that came about because of this whole saga. But, basically they were saying, like, we are not rescinding the underlying executive order. We are not telling anyone, well, that was too many negatives, but, we want to freeze the funding. And, in the last week or so, there have been a lot of reported issues from grantees being unable to access payments across a whole range of federal programs, across agencies. It hasn't been totally consistent, but many, many reports of grantees not receiving funding in one form or another from a federal agency. So, like I said, there are two lawsuits that sort of tie this whole thing up in litigation at the moment. There's the National Council of Nonprofits versus OMB. That, like I said, is the coalition of nonprofits and others. They got a temporary restraining order on February 3rd that the defendants are enjoined from implementing, giving effect to, or reinstating under a different name that original OMB memo, that January 27th memo that was supposedly rescinded. And then I'm realizing now the date in this slide is wrong, but in the state's case as well, the judge issued a temporary restraining order. No, that date is right, never mind. A temporary restraining order basically saying that the agencies should not freeze their funding to the states. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about what these two TROs mean. They are in place temporarily. There's no end date on them, but basically the court will have more time to think about the issues and possibly issue preliminary injunctions, which would be sort of a longer standing stop on this if they choose to do so. But at the moment, there's still a lot of uncertainty around what the scope of these TROs are. It seems the nonprofits TRO is pretty broad. There's a reading of the state's TRO that would limit it only to states. The lawsuits, of course, they challenged the January 27th memo, but of course that was rescinded. So there's a lack of clarity around whether it applies to the executive orders underlying all of this. There has been some movement towards compliance, like some of the agencies have said to their personnel, like, hey, we've got to comply with this. But the situation on the ground has been very mixed, and there are still a lot of reports of grantees not getting their funding under IRA and EJA programs across a whole range of other policy areas as well. So that's kind of where we stand with that. We'll have additional hearings in both of these cases. I just had word that the next hearing in the state's case will be February 21st, which is a couple of weeks away. And the court that will consider a preliminary injunction. I'm sure the nonprofits case also has a hearing coming up if it's not been scheduled already. So, for folks who do have federal contracts right now, to the extent you are denied a payment or a payment is late, you may have a contractual claim, but that's going to depend very much on the terms of your contracts with the federal agency. Like I said, those temporary restraining orders still very much in flux, and I think more to the point, compliance with them has been really varied. It's one thing for the court to tell the agencies they have to do something, but if they're not doing it, it's still causing a lot of chaos. And then, what I'm saying to folks that have federal contracts, to the extent you're able to keep complying, keep complying. If you owe reports, if you owe certifications, there are other things you can do to maintain your compliance with those contracts. I think that's a best practice right now. It puts you in, the right positioning for when all of this is resolved for the relevant agency not to kind of call a foot fault on you and say that you're out of compliance with the contract. Of course, a lot of lot of these contracts require like real money and resources to perform. I can't sort of give you guidance on how to weigh that determination, but to the extent you are able to continue complying, I think that's the best practice. So I'm going to switch gears for a little bit, talk about some of the other things that have happened in the last couple of weeks. One of the major things that came about through those executive orders on day one was a rollback of environmental justice policy at the federal level. So environmental justice policy is generally set through executive order, at least at the federal level of government. Some of it makes its way into like the IRA and some of the EJA programs, right? Like there are environmental justice components. But environmental justice policy in the federal government is almost entirely set out by executive order, which means that a future president can very easily roll it all back, and that is what happened. So, one of the big things that's changed is that the Justice 40 commitment has gone away. That was set out in an executive order under President Biden. Justice 40, of course, is the commitment that certain federal climate and clean energy dollars go to or to the benefit of disadvantaged communities. That is no longer federal policy. The climate and economic justice screening tool, the CJUST, that also has effectively gone away. CJUST was developed because an executive order directed the Council on Environmental Quality, the White House CEQ, to make it. And so, we no longer have that screening tool. It has actually been taken down off of the federal government's website. You can still access the tool and the underlying data on a privately hosted website at Harvard University, but this is no longer, the policy of the land. And then, of course, we've had memos come out from the Office of Personnel Management directing agencies to place DEI and environmental justice staff on leave, and the reporting suggests very strongly that that is happening quite rapidly. So, I say this all because it obviously impacts like federal environmental justice policy, but it also very much impacts your work at the local level. You're going to have a very difficult time getting the federal government to help you with EJ questions or questions about where to cite things, how to identify disadvantaged communities. Just all of that is going to go, all of that capacity is going to go away already has gone away. And that's going to have ripple effects throughout your local work. So we'll do a little bit of a medium deep dive into the EV mandate piece of all of this, because obviously we've heard a lot about the so-called EV mandate from Trump and his allies, and it came up specifically in one of the big executive orders, the Unleashing American Energy EO, which we've mentioned already. It was this sort of omnibus energy executive order. Directing federal agencies to eliminate the electric vehicle mandate. There is no EV mandate at the federal level, so we've got to kind of read between the lines, like what do we mean here? And it's just sort of putting some of the pieces together, both for things that were directly mentioned in the executive orders, but also beyond that. I'm going to go through each of these, so I won't read them aloud, but there's a whole range of things that the administration could try and roll back from a regulatory perspective, could take different stances in litigation on, could abandon. There are really significant legal questions about the administration's ability to do all of what I'm about to talk about. But these are sort of the things that I expect to see. There will be litigation, there will be new rulemakings, there will be an attempt not to enforce existing rules, and that's going to kind of lead to a lot of confusion, a lot of litigation. It's going to take a very long time to unwind, just as it did during the first Trump administration. So the first thing that is very much in the crosshairs is EPA's greenhouse gas pollution rules for vehicles, those vehicle tailpipe rules. These rules were filed in March of 2024, and the light-duty rules effectively require that about 56% of new passenger vehicles in 2030 to 2032 will be electric because of the rule. It doesn't require them to be electric, but it sets a standard and allows vehicle manufacturers to meet that standard through a fleet-wide average. And the expected outcome is that over half of new vehicles by model year 2030 to 2032 will be electric as a result. This is something that is a final rule, meaning that EPA went through the full rulemaking process that involves a notice and comment period. It allows anyone in the country to comment on the rulemaking. They have to do interagency review. They have to do cost-benefit analyses. There's a whole lot of things that go into the formal rulemaking process, and this was completed in March 2024. So the Trump administration cannot easily roll it back. But they certainly can try. They can try to do a new rulemaking that would roll this one back, and it would take that full period of time to do the notice and comment and all of the other work associated with it. This is something I would expect to see try to happen. I don't know how successful it will be just because of the time it takes and litigation that's ongoing around all of this. The National Highway Traffic Safety, why am I losing the acronym, NHTSA, they set the CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy. So these rules were also finalized earlier on in 2024. So these also are final rules. They require vehicles to get about 2% increase in fuel economy year over year. Again, the Trump administration could try to roll those back through a new rulemaking process. The California waiver, I'm sure many of you are familiar with California's unique ability to get a waiver under the Clean Air Act to set more stringent vehicle pollution standards than the national standards. In general, states are preempted from setting their own vehicle pollution standards, at least for newly sold motor vehicles. But California has this unique ability to go get a waiver from the EPA. And once they get that waiver, other states may adopt those same California rules. So this obviously has a real impact in the market, right? Basically, vehicle manufacturers kind of have to come to the table and negotiate with California and figure out how to meet that more stringent standard once so much of the country adopts their more stringent rules. California's Advanced Clean Cars 2 is the most relevant rule that recently got a waiver from the EPA, and it requires new model year vehicles starting in 2035 to be electric vehicles, at least if they're sold within California. So California has received a waiver for that rule. That one cannot be rolled back through a rulemaking. It's a different process. But during the first Trump administration, we saw the administration attempt to roll back a couple of California's waivers, and there was significant litigation over all of this. So expect to see that again. I think I covered most of this, but yeah, I mean, we're going to see just lots and lots of litigation surrounding all of this. It's just going to constantly be in flux. There's both going to be, challenges from environmental groups and more democratic-leaning states pushing back against any regulatory rollbacks. There's already litigation happening around a lot of this stuff, but it was the generally red state attorney generals and oil industry groups sort of suing because they didn't like the rules. So I would expect the Justice Department under this administration to take a different positioning, ask to hold those cases in abeyance, or otherwise just not defend them robustly. I think we went through all of this already, but basically expect to see as much of this rolled back as they are able to manage, and lots and lots of litigation surrounding all of it. So one thing that is new during this administration is that the executive orders suggest that the Trump administration would like to reopen what's called the endangerment finding. So the endangerment finding was a 2009 scientific finding by the EPA that greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare, and that new vehicles contribute to that pollution. Under Section 202 of the Clean Air Act, once the EPA has made that scientific determination with respect to a pollutant, it is required to regulate. So this is the legal basis that underpins all of EPA's regulation of greenhouse gas pollution from motor vehicles. It's really important. The first time around, the first Trump administration, there was some talk of trying to roll back the endangerment finding, but for whatever political reasons, they decided not to. But this time around, this executive order directs EPA to look at the question and make recommendations about it. So it's possible that in addition to this sort of normal regulatory rollbacks and litigation that we would see, that we might see EPA and the administration going after the endangerment finding itself. And there's really no precedent for what that would look like. Small bit of good news, I suppose. Tax credits have been largely spared in the last 2 weeks, mostly because the administration cannot do anything on its own about tax credits. Those are in the tax code, they are law. In order for anyone to take away your right to claim a tax credit, including those credits you might claim via direct pay, Congress would have to act. So it does not seem that these executive orders are meant to capture tax credits. Again, it's only been 2 weeks, and how many people have made tax filings in the first 2 weeks of the year? Probably pretty close to zero. So we don't know for sure, but it does seem that at least by the terms of the executive order and by the terms of the other guidance that has come out in the last 2 weeks, that tax credits have not yet been impacted. Of course, because we haven't really seen anyone file their tax claims in the last 2 weeks, we don't really know how the IRS is going to implement all of this and whether they'll make it more difficult to file some of these tax credits, including through direct pay. We also know that Congress is expected to negotiate at least one tax bill in 2025. And pretty much everything's on the table. So you can sort of read the press, read the sort of horse race any day, and get a different sense of where the vehicle tax credits stand in all of this. But we should expect they're on the table. To the extent you have a line to your local representatives, this would be a really good time to tell them how much you value those tax credits and how much you value being able to take them via elective pay. A lot of representatives don't even know what elective pay is, so it might be a bit of a learning curve there, but really, really important to send representatives, particularly from red areas, back to Congress when they go to negotiate this tax bill to hopefully protect those to the extent we're able. This is definitely a time when you can have influence in this space. Also, if you've got projects that qualify for elective pay, make those filings, just get them in. These tax credits are still on the books, you're still entitled to them. Make those filings, get them in on time. First of all, try and get those dollars, right? But second of all, show how valuable this program is by using it. Again, experiences on the ground have very much varied. I'm not personally aware of any CFI grantee that's gone in to draw money and not received it, but that I wouldn't necessarily be, and I understand that grantees of all sorts are being denied payments or even shut out of their payment accounts to make those claims for payment. Wouldn't surprise me if the next round of NEVI funding is held up, but that's obviously little ways down the line, and all sorts of things could happen between now and then. So I hate to just throw more uncertainty into the mix, but everything is really in flux, and we know these two programs are sort of in the crosshairs, but we don't know specifically any more than that what's going to happen to them, other than that we know that the administration doesn't like them. So to bring things sort of back around, I think if there was one other headline item that came out of the last 2 weeks or came out of day one, it's that the president put in motion the process to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who wants them, so I think Anne has them. Feel free to take pictures too, but you can have the slides. So the Putting America First in International Environmental Agreements executive order directs the ambassador to the United Nations to start the process for withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. The process technically takes a year, but we're going to act as though we're out of it immediately. The one thing that I do sort of want to highlight here, because I think it's relevant to local governments, is the way that the Paris process works. So Paris is not an agreement where every country agrees to do the same exact thing. What happens, rather, is that each country submits its own nationally determined contribution, or NDC, and that comprises that country's commitment under the Paris framework. So the US last submitted its NDC just 2 months ago, December 2024, and these are due every 5 years. And if you do the math, which I can do very simple math, that means that by the time we next owe an NDC, Trump will be out of office. So it is conceivable. I don't want to overstate this. Obviously, all of this makes it far less likely that we will meet our Paris climate targets or come anywhere close. And we didn't even get into the things that aren't really like local government focused, like cutting off all offshore wind development. Like all of this is going to make it so much harder for us to meet our targets. But it is conceivable that cities and other subnational actors stay the course on their own work, sufficient that we get a new administration, even a new Congress in 2 years, that sets policy that's more consistent with our NDC under the Paris framework. Obviously, a huge amount of damage is being done on the international stage. Like I don't mean to overstate this, but the way that the timing works out, such that subnationals do have the opportunity to stay the course here for a few years. So what does that all mean for local governments? Like I said, really critical to advancing those Paris Agreement targets, along with all of the other sectors, right? It's certainly not only local governments, but states, universities, tribes, nonprofits, community groups, businesses. Like there's a real opportunity here. You obviously have your continued implementation of your operational climate work and your leadership within your communities. And then there's lots of support coming from local government-focused networks like SSDN, like Nick and Ann, who are really looking to get you as much information as you need to at least navigate the space, even if we don't have all of the answers. And like I said at the top, what I really want you to take away from this is, hopefully a little bit of information about where we're at, but also just some comfort that there are folks in this room who are paying close attention to this stuff and who want to help you get the answers that you need at any given time. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. I'll open it up.
Okay, so we've got this cool microphone in a box thing, so you don't even have to feel shy about coming up here. We can throw the box to you. So does anybody have anything that they want to ask?
Is anyone terrified now?
Just raise your hand and I will throw it. Okay, I'm not the most athletic, so here we go.
I expected it to be heavy, Dory. I thought you were going to take my head off. Okay. Well, I don't know if you have a sense of. Oh, okay. We've been hearing conflicting reports about the TRO and whether it applies only to the states that were a party to the lawsuit or applies more broadly to all states. Do you have a sense of that? I think initially we thought it applied to all states, but there were some media reports that implied only states.
It is unclear.
Oh, okay.
Having read the language, it is unclear. Different lawyers read it differently. It kind of reads as though it only applies to the states that sued. There's also the nonprofits case. There's a TRO there as well that may have broader applicability. We're not going to get a clear answer on this for a couple of weeks until we have further hearings in this space. So you are correct in both senses.
So, Heather Bullock, City of Charlotte, North Carolina. I was just curious, the IRA tax credits, direct pay is really beneficial for us. And one of the things that, we keep asking the experts, whoever might come by, about what they think about that. And I heard you say that it's going to take a while. Obviously, it's in legislation, but for example, and typically in the past, because I was asked about the history of, coming back and taking away tax credits, and typically that doesn't happen, things that are actually beneficial to, tax credits beneficial to citizens or residents are not taken. But I guess I'm just wondering about, like, for example, 2025, right? If I go and buy an EV, right, and I go to the dealership and they have they pay for it ahead of time, and then it comes back around. Let's say sometime during the year they're able to pass legislation to roll back these tax credits, then is there any, in your mind, would it be retroactive to do that? Like if I buy today and then they retroactive say no tax credits for 2025, then will I have to pay that $7,500, for example?
So almost always Congress would set these changes to the tax code prospectively, not retroactively. I think there would be very serious legal questions about them setting them retroactively. So I don't want to step out on a limb and say what is or isn't going to happen, because we are in unprecedented times. But it would be highly unusual for Congress to enact a tax credit, to roll back a tax credit retroactively. That would run afoul of all sorts of constitutional principles and just not be consistent with practice either.
So good afternoon, Carrie Black with Orange County. So curious about the bipartisan infrastructure law. How does that relate with these two? Like, is it kind of getting the same attention? Because we were definitely looking at our EECBG grant, and then just kind of if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, so the BIL grants are caught up in all of this. They're, EJA is actually named in the executive order. We're going to, pause funding on all IRA and bill programs. The only little bit of relief from that was a memo the next day saying roads and bridges and things can still happen. But yes, I'm also concerned about EECBG. I think, another just sort of data point is, apparently a lot of folks have had trouble working with DOE over the last 2 weeks. They've been, canceling meetings and shutting people out of payment portals. So, yeah, I would expect it to be caught up in this. It's sort of a strange time to be a lawyer, because you give people the sort of legal answer and then the what's happening answer, right? The legal answer is you are entitled to those EECBG funds, right? You've been awarded them, they're obligated to you. The answer on the ground has, for the last couple of weeks, been quite a bit more difficult than that, and particularly, I think, at DOE.
Thank you.
I'm Ray Atkinson, City of Key West. I'm curious about public engagement, especially when it comes from DEI. I know that you mentioned positions being cut, but from public outreach standpoint, I'm looking at planning for disadvantaged communities and Black and Brown communities. Is that allowed anymore? Is it, can you even put DEI in planning processes anymore?
It is a really good question, and it is one that I think it's too soon to know. You've probably got some federal contracts, right? You've received some awards, you've got contracts. The terms of what you're supposed to do in those contracts are set out, and you and the federal agency are obligated to one another under the terms of those contracts. How that's meant to interplay with an executive order telling people no more DEI, no more EJ, they don't legally match up. So it's unclear how that's going to play out. In terms of what you do that doesn't involve federal funding, that is not impacted, right? You are certainly allowed to incorporate EJ, incorporate a notion of disadvantaged communities, other DEI principles into your own work. The federal government has nothing to say about that.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to come get it. There's a lot of coffee and stuff on the table here. Greg Carlton, I'm with the City of Greensboro, and I'm curious about CMAQ and CRP and some of these other programs. Have you heard any details about them? Or?
I don't, no. I haven't heard at that level of detail,
Okay.
no.
Another thing we're not sure about is that we got a FTA grant for electric buses, and we're not sure if we're going to get the funds for that or not. So
Have you
probably it's all caught up in this, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think a key question is whether or not those funds have been obligated, so whether you have a signed agreement
Right, right.
with the relevant agency. That's going to, protect you at least as far as it is able to, right? Like, you are still entitled to those dollars, even if this is all tied up in sort of a mess that's happening that's unlawful. If you've just been like awarded in name, but you don't have a finalized grant agreement, those dollars are going to be much more
Some of them
at
have
risk.
been obligated and some haven't, so
Yeah.
I guess it spans, multiple different possibilities of what could happen with
Yeah,
the
I
money,
mean, for the
but-
unobligated dollars, there's a political question of whether an agency wants to pull back on commitments that it's made, particularly in districts that it wants to keep happy. For the obligated dollars, it is going to be caught up in all of this, but the terms of your contract should still prevail.
Thank you. And, oh,
I don't
That's a
really have a
easy
question
pass.
more than a request. So Rick Longabart, City of Raleigh, thank you. Great presentation, Amy, fantastic, great information. How do we get a copy of the story?
A
All right. Whoever wants the next. Ready? I'm going to
Throw that. Don't throw it at a blind man. Is 90 days a reasonable time to expect any kind of change, outcome, direction in this pausing of everything? We got a CFI grant, then they sent out this notice on the 21st that the webinars are canceled.
Yep.
So is it realistic to expect that we'll know something in 90 days, or?
I mean, it certainly runs counter to the amount of folks that are being put on leave at the agencies. Like, I don't know how they are meant to do all of this work in the next 90 days. What I would say also is that the order requires, for funding to start flowing again, even after those 90 days, order requires approval from the director of the OMB. So that's another sort of gating item. It's like we do this 90-day review, but then you've got to, if you want to start dollars again after this review, you've got to talk to OMB about it. So the answer to your question, I don't know, like timing-wise, whether that's reasonable or not, but I wouldn't expect like 90 days is just going to be this magic amount of time.
So with both of these big programs, Inflation Reduction Act and BIL on hold, all of these other things at DOT, and then they want to cut that workforce, all of these are DOT programs. Is there any possibility that they'll have the resources to actually follow through on any of this stuff?
I think it's going to get a lot more difficult. Like, I think even if this all this goes away and it was like really was a 90-day pause, I think it's going to be slower to get your reimbursements. It's going to be harder to get your questions answered. They're not going to be staffed in the same way that they were before, and that is going to make this more difficult.
Okay.
You've got a comedian tonight. Right now, it's just bad news. I'm sorry.
Hi, Sheetal Alma, City of Key West. So just wanted to kind of like clarify my understanding. So it was to be that all new vehicles were supposed, 56% of them between, you said 20, 30, and 32, were to be EV. So like, is that going to be pulled back? Is that happening, not happening? If yes, and if no, like a little bit, I think I'm like confused, and I don't know if everybody else is too. But if there's some sort of clarification you can
Yeah, sure.
provide.
So nothing
Please,
has
thank you.
happened there yet. So we're talking about an EPA rule that sets greenhouse gas pollution standards for vehicles. It's a limit on the amount of pollution that that new vehicles that manufacturers sell anywhere in the country can have. And vehicle manufacturers can meet that standard as a fleet-wide average. So some of the vehicles they produce can pollute more than that, and some of them would have to produce less than that in order to hit that average. And what we would expect, based on the modeling of the greenhouse gas standard, is that a little over half of the new vehicles in those model years will be electric in order for vehicle manufacturers to hit that fleet-wide average. So they want to keep making like gas-guzzling SUVs, right? So they're also going to put more EVs on the market so that they can do both and still hit the average. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
then what hasn't happened yet, but what I expect will happen, is that EPA will attempt to roll back that rule. They'll attempt to rescind it. So what they have to do is they have to, basically start a new rulemaking, and that's a formal process in an administrative agency. So they'll, give out notice that they are rescinding this rule, perhaps replacing it with a new one, perhaps not. That'll have to go through a whole formal process. And one of the major parts of that process is a comment period. So an opportunity for anyone in the country to submit comments about how they feel about the rule. They want it stronger, they want it weaker, they like it, they don't like it. They have to do a number of other things. They have to do a cost-benefit analysis, they have to do interagency review. There's just like a whole checklist of things that they need to do in accordance with that rulemaking process. And if they get to the end of that, then they can put out the newer, weaker rule and rescind the old one. None of that has happened yet, but that's what the executive orders are suggesting they would like to happen. They're basically directing EPA, in this case, other agencies in other cases, to take a look at their rules and figure out how to roll them back.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
And just to be clear, that has nothing to do with whether or not people want to buy an EV. Right.
Yeah.
Right, and so the part of the reason why we're sort of framing that market story at the beginning is that if consumers keep behaving consistently with how they're behaving right now, we're going to get close to that target based on how consumers are currently purchasing cars.
And most automakers don't want it rolled back either, right? Like automakers, they don't want regulation, but what they really don't want is uncertainty. So like if they're on track to meet these more stringent rules, they don't really want them to be rolled back. But that's where we are. It's generally like an oil company thing, like an oil industry thing, wants them rolled back so they can sell more gas. But
don't you see that the closer you get to that time period, if this isn't resolved, the manufacturers are going to hedge their bets and not have as many EVs available because they're unsure that it's going to be necessary?
I think if the auto industry was a domestic industry, yes, but it's not. It's a global industry. And so this transition is happening across the world. And the automakers that make cars here sell cars there. And so this uncertainty is really difficult for them. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how they lobby over this next period of time. And I think part of why we may not see the tax credits on the chopping block right now is because some of that lobbying is going on. Because a lot of that manufacturing investment I was speaking about earlier is happening in America because to get those tax credits, you have to have a certain percentage of your batteries coming from here or most favored nation trade agreements, and you have to have final assembly of that vehicle here. So you have the auto industry investing all that money to build up that ability to achieve those tax credits. That's going to be a market-driven phenomenon that really has little to do with this rule. What the rule does is like really create that certainty for the auto industry. They know that they've got to hit this by then. And it just helps them kind of organize that pace. But it going away isn't like the end of people buying EVs. I'm still buying EVs.
I just got one. Okay. Hey. Oh. Okay. Hey, I'm Ashante Green, Jacksonville, Florida. Always great to see you.
likewise.
This is really grim. This is really sad. So my question to you is there a shining light or any optimistic things or any good things you're hearing about, aside from the lawsuits, folks pushing back? Can you give us some brightness, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to your point, like a lot of this is happening anyway, right? And so a a lot of what is happening is market transformation, and people really want this, right? People are concerned about public health. They're concerned about livability. Companies are sort of coming along with it. Like, I think there's only so much that the administration can do here. They can make this all more expensive by rolling back tax credits. They can make it easier to pollute by rolling back regulations, but a lot of the progress will not be lost, right? Automakers, to Stan's point, like already making lots of electric vehicles and want to make more of them so they can sell overseas. Like some of this is just baked in. I think another thing I'm giving this presentation a lot. It is pretty depressing. I think a lot of it is just this is going to just be a really dynamic space, and there's going to be lots of opportunities to act and to do the things you want to do and to advocate for what you want to keep. It's going to be difficult over the next 4 years, but there are going to be a lot of opportunities, and we're really going to rely, I think, on our networks to sort of help figure out what those are and where to plug in.
I want to pile on to what Stan and Amy have just said about the bright light. NPR did a great article recently where they interviewed the car manufacturers, they interviewed the people who are putting in charging stations, every person in the manufacturing facility or sphere, I guess. You've got Wawa is putting in electric vehicle charging stations without anybody else's money. Pilot is doing it. Love's is thinking about it. But Marathon and Buc-ee's, I mean, you name it, all of these folks are putting in vehicle charging stations at their gas stations because they see that change coming. I do think that we all have an obligation here, too, to go next car, all electric. Let's just all be the change we want to see in the world. I think that matters, and I think also, to Ashante's point, we got to keep looking for some bright lights, and in all honesty, we have to be that for each other. So,
thank you, Casey. Very, very powerful words. I have a question, in terms of legal ease. The temporary restraining order, the judge basically said, agencies go forth and let the money flow. So, if the EPA is like, no, we won't do it, what's the recourse, or how do we fix that? How do we get over that?
So we're hoping to get some more clarity in these two lawsuits in the coming weeks, and I do want to talk about that in a minute. Basically in a couple of weeks, there will be hearings in both of these cases where the judges decide on a preliminary injunction, which is like a longer-term restraining order, basically like while this litigation goes through, the funding freeze is halted. And I would hope that when we get those preliminary injunctions, the courts have learned their lessons and worded these better, because that's what's causing some of the confusion right now. I think some of what's happening is, from what I understand from folks who've worked in federal agencies, they're like very hierarchical places, and so until your boss tells you to do X thing, to turn on the money, it doesn't happen. So some of this is taking time to flow through from like OMB to the agency heads to the agency's staff. Some of these agencies are getting new administrators or secretaries in real time. What I would do is, if you are being denied payments or not able to get into your portal, a couple of things. One is keep very good records, take screenshots of everything so that you have all of that. And then a group called Lawyers for Good Government is running a funding protection clinic. So they have an intake form that you can fill out and say, like, I've been denied payment or such and such has happened. They will see if you're a good fit for their legal services or try and point you in the direction of resources that can help you get that unstuck.
Thank you.
So if I can take a minute to go back on the lawsuits. This slide. So State of New York versus Trump. We at the Sabin Center are preparing what's called an amicus brief in this case. An amicus brief means that you're not a party to the litigation, but you're providing a brief to help the court understand certain issues better. Amicus means friend of the court. So we are preparing an amicus brief on behalf of local governments, cities, states, counties, any form of local government, and local government associations. We will be filing this brief next Friday, and it will sort of lay out why local governments are differently positioned than the state petitioners, advocate for very broad relief so that these preliminary injunctions are worded better than the TROs. And we are looking for as many local government signatories as possible. For reference, there was an amicus brief filed by local governments in the birthright citizenship case. They had 74 local government signatories on that amicus brief, so we'd love to get in the 50 to 100 local government range. We would need someone with authority within your local government to sign on to that. It could be a mayor, it could be a ranking official, it could be a city attorney. So if this is something that you think your local government might be interested in, I would be super grateful if you would pass this back. You can either email me, Anne has the information as well, so you can email Anne. We are looking for signatories by Monday, so it's a very tight turnaround. But we'd be super, super grateful to have folks, especially in these southern states, sign on to make that case from the local perspective, because a lot of your states did not join this lawsuit, and we want to be like, look, local governments really care about this, even if their states don't. The other thing we're looking for in connection with this brief, if your cities and local governments are comfortable, is any narrative inputs for this brief. So if you want to tell us something that has happened or that might happen to you as a result of this funding freeze, so we can craft that narrative. I know not every local government is comfortable sort of going on the record in that way, but if you do have stories of impact, that would be helpful to us as well.
Yeah, and SSDN members will be getting an email today with this information. If you could CC us when you communicate with the Sabin Center, that would be great, so we can track as well. I think, as Amy kind of intimated, this is something that for y'all's sake, you definitely want to make sure your mayor or council or administrator, whoever you need to make sure is on board, just from a sensitivities perspective. And the L4GG clinic information will also be in that email. But if you don't get that or have other questions, you guys know where to find us. At 12:30 it went out.
Sorry, Monday. What did you say? No, we're going to file next Friday. So we would like signatories to let us know by Monday. Yeah. That'll give us some time to make sure we have the right person from your local government and get a draft out to everyone. Are there any other questions I can answer? I'm going to bop out for a little bit, but I will be back towards the end of the session if anyone wants to chat about anything. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Amy.